Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about 1968. You know, I've been around for a while, and I've seen a lot of history, and I've always been interested in history. And from my earliest days to the present day, I've been a keen observer of what has gone on. So I'd like to talk a little bit from my personal memories of 1968. 50 years ago now. Isn't that amazing? How does time fly so fast? Well, I must tell you, if I have to explain 1968 to you, it was a time unlike any the United States had ever seen before. Now, let me give you a little precursor before we go into 1968. The 1960s was a revolution, a massive revolution. And if you look at the 1950s, from its start to its end, you would sit there and say, there really wasn't that much difference. Sure, the music changed a bit, but clothing didn't change much. Society didn't change much. But once we get to the 1960s, everything changes. All bets are off. Everything changes. When the 60s started, 1961, it was kind of like an extension of the 1950s, if you think about it. It was very similar. Just look at how the 1960s ended in 1970. It's a totally different world. Something you didn't even recognize. If you went to sleep in 1961 and woke up in 1970, you would be like shocked, like, where am I? What is this? So, if I may, let me mention a few things that I recall. First off, Vietnam. Vietnam was a part of everyone's life. Nobody did not know what Vietnam looked like. We saw it every night on the news. And with that, we would see the newscaster, whomever it would be, Walter Cronkite, Huntley Brinkley, or whomever, talk about how many soldiers were killed. We didn't talk about the Viet Cong or the South Vietnamese. We never talked about their deaths, but we just talked about how many American soldiers were killed, because that seemed to be all we were interested in at the time. It was a different age. And everybody was thinking about Vietnam, and anyone in school knew that eventually their number would come up. I remember going into high school and watching the seniors go off to Vietnam. And I said, well, just a few more years, but it ended before I became a senior. But stepping back into 1968, I must say that there were riots, there was pandemonium, there was assassinations, there was total changes in culture. Now, perhaps one of the most wonderful ways to illustrate the 1960s would be using the Beatles. If you get a chance, take a look at the Beatles on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1964. Take a look at the Beatles in 1968. Totally different. They had jackets and ties on at The Ed Sullivan Show. By the 1968-69 period, toward the end of the Beatles, they were in multicolored outfits into Indian culture and to drug culture. And the hair was very long, bell bottoms, everything. Everything had changed. Social change on the highest order. Another thing that's very important in the 1960s that we don't talk about enough, and that is the whole idea of equal rights. The era of the 1960s is when African Americans, after going through decades of hell, finally had a voice that was speaking for them. That was Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King was in the news a lot. And in 1968, he was assassinated. And all of the work that he had done to try to bring people together blew up. And all of the urban centers all over the country exploded in riots. It was really awful. Now, shortly after that, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. It was a terrible year in 1968 in that regard. Got to remember, in 1968, it had just been 5 years since President Kennedy had been assassinated. And it had been 3 years since Malcolm X had been assassinated. There was lots of anarchy in the air. And there was a lot of anti-war protests going on. You know, you'd watch the news and you'd see how many people were killed. And college campuses exploded and students took over, like Columbia University. It was a whole massive riot and they took over the whole school. And people were burning their draft cards and going to Canada. And there were protests and they were screaming, LBJ, LBJ, how many boys have you killed today? In amongst all this, music, the drug culture. You know, I remember as a kid going down to the beaches. You know, I lived in Florida at the time. And there would be all the Volkswagen vans with big flowers on them, and folks all in tie-dyed outfits, all smoking pot and stoned out of their minds. And they all had the surfboards on top of the Volkswagen vans. It's interesting to think that's 50 years ago, and those hippies, those are our senior citizens today. I'm sure they think differently than they did then. But music was different. So much was different. You had the space program going on. In amongst all of this, you had the space program. Now, in 1967, of course, they had a massive fire. 3 astronauts were killed, so it kind of slowed down this whole thing for going to the moon. But 1968 was a big year. We sent up several Apollo missions. And I remember watching them keenly in Christmas. I think, was it Apollo 9, Apollo 8? In which they were reading some biblical text as they were going around the moon. Jim Lovell, I believe his name was reading it. That was pretty fascinating. This is in amongst the social upheaval, in amongst the whole upheaval on black rights, in amongst this whole upheaval of Vietnam, in amongst this whole upheaval of drafts, colleges, equal rights, the women's movement. So much was going on. And in the middle of all of this, it was an election year, 1968. Now, of course, we expected probably Robert Kennedy was probably going to be the Democratic nominee, perhaps. We don't really know. Some people say he never would have made it. I have a feeling he might have. But nonetheless, he was assassinated. And so it ended up being for the Republicans Richard Nixon and for the Democrats Hubert Humphrey. And perhaps the greatest riot of 1968 was in Chicago during the Democratic National Convention. It was horrific. I don't know what words to use. Tens of thousands of people were there protesting. There were battles. There were battles with the police. There were murders. There was anarchy in every form you can think of. And nobody knew what was going to happen. In fact, a lot of people thought the whole country was going to collapse. That's how bad 1968 was. Of course, I had my bell bottoms. A lot of people had bell bottoms. It's always interesting with bell bottoms. You know, in school, it was a fascinating thing. You could hear throughout the halls the swish of bell bottoms rubbing together, and it made this very loud sound. Something we don't think of today, you know. But, you know, just reminiscing about the year 1968. All the things that were going on. I'm sure I've missed a lot of things. But, you know, 1969 would follow. 1970 and the 60s would end. And the 1970s would, in a sense, be very, very different from the 60s. Much more like the 1950s, although time was moving faster and trends came quicker. But there was a certain amount of sameness in a lot of the 1970s, which you did not have at all in the 1960s. So, a few thoughts, a few memories of 1968 from someone who was there.